How would you define nutrition, and why is it important?
So before I define that, I always talk about nutrition from the cellular point of view, because that's also part of my educational background. We're made of trillions of cells, and the reason why we have the hunger feeling is because we need to provide nutrition to our cells. So our cells need ingredients to support the structure, the function, as well as energy. So we could look at nutrition as nutritious food, or it could be just food with no nutrition. So obviously, if we provide the nutritious food to our cells, we have healthy cells. If we not provide healthy food to our cells, we have unhealthy cells, and this is when we start seeing diseases.
So I guess when it comes to that type of thing, we all have different restrictions in our diets, and sometimes it's a moral belief, sometimes it's cost or intolerances. Are there common factors that we should all be considering, regardless of those beliefs, that we should make sure we get into our diet?
So if we look at the human body from an evolutionary point of view, we have evolved to be eating macronutrients, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fat. Obviously, under each category, we have also classes. We have the simple carbohydrates, we have the complex carbohydrates, we have the healthy fats, the unhealthy fats. Our brain is made in a way to crave food that we need. So if we stop eating carbohydrates, obviously we're going to be craving carbohydrates, because we need all these macronutrients. We also need the micronutrients, which include the minerals and the vitamins. So anytime we deprive our body from these major nutrients, we're going to we will start craving them. I would say if we stick to a wholesome diet, meaning whole food, no processed food, we should be getting most of our nutrients. Obviously, we have to have a balance and we have to have a variety. So if we do it that way, we should be fine.
Okay.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess when it comes to things like being a vegetarian, like being a vegan, obviously there's concerns from that perspective that they may not get the nutrients they need. Is it enough to take supplements? Ideally, you might say, oh, you should be taking the real thing, but is, let's say, fish oil tablets enough as a kind of a second best option?
As a nutritionist, we always advise people not to be taking supplements. I'm not sure about the supplements in Sweden or in Europe, but in the US, the supplements are not regulated by the FDA. So anyone could come up with a supplement, market it, and say, well, this is going to help your brain, this is going to help your bones, but there's no oversight of supplements from the FDA in the US. So it's better to be getting all the nutrients from your food because as well, the food has synergistic effect, meaning that one component would be helping another component with absorption, for example. We don't see that from supplements. Like speaking of omega-3, also we know that most of the omega-3 comes from fish that's coming from a polluted sea. In that case, yes, I would supplement with omega-3 supplements. As long as I know the sources, I would go with brands that have been on the market for a long time, because anything new, we don't have much information about the safety of that supplement.
Got you. It's slightly terrifying that the FDA doesn't regulate.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is.
But they're getting there.
They're getting there. Okay, good.
There's some changes now. Yeah.
Okay, good. It's less terrifying then. Okay, so it's kind of a two-parter question, this one. Obviously, the lecture that I mentioned earlier, which was truly fascinating. I feel very smart. You explore a real-world example of how important the right nutrition is. I was wondering if you could explain more about the brain and how the diet impacts its structure and function, and then if you had time to kind of go into a bit more specific detail about the myelin sheath.
For a long time, people didn't think that our nutrition can affect our brain, because for a long time we thought that nutrition mostly affects our physical health. It's only with advancement in imaging study, now we can tell that people who were following, let's say, the unhealthy diet, like the Western diet, tend to have more brain shrinkage. And those who follow the healthy diet, for example, like the Mediterranean diet, tend to have more preservation of the brain. So the concept of the diet helping the brain is a new concept. So from an imaging point of view, there are two major structures in the brain. We have the white matter and we have the gray matter. Both are made up of neurons, which are the basic cell in the brain. The white matter has an insulation that's going to help with the conduction of the impulses in the brain. This is how neurons communicate. Each region in the brain is part of the gray matter. The white matter is more a connection between the regions. Mm-hmm. So each region of the gray matter has a function, and the white matter is a communication between those regions. The white matter is made up of different type of proteins and fats. And those proteins have different turnover, meaning that we break those down and we have to replenish them. Same thing with the fat, we break it down and we replenish. This is ideal for the brain because it wants to have its optimal function. So when people do not consume all the ingredients needed for the myelin sheath, eventually there will be breakage or microlesions in the myelin sheath. So the communication between the regions is affected. So we have different regions that also could affect mental health because we have what's called the limbic system. This is the region where we generate our emotions, and we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the region that's going to control our emotions. If we don't have effective communications between these two regions, obviously we won't be able to control our emotions, so our emotions are aberrant, which could lead to mental health problems.
So the white matter, in a sense, is kind of the WhatsApp of your brain and all the parts of your friends, and it's how you communicate with all of your friends, in a way, basically. Yours is much more scientific than my version, though.
I'm sorry, you were breaking. I didn't hear the last question.
It was a bad joke. I said your version was much more scientific than my WhatsApp comparison. But I'm glad you laughed.
I think we need both versions, right, to make
exactly. I agree. Well, great teamwork. You mentioned again in that lecture you had a study where you discovered that antibiotics, when you didn't replenish your microbiotics in the gut, had a serious impact on your brain and on your mental well-being. I was wondering if we could dive in to get a bit more information about the gut-brain link and how, when it's not respected, bad things can happen.
Sure. So let me give you a brief overview of what the study is. We had collected data from a clinic on people who have used antibiotics. And we use data mining technique to identify what are the source or what factors contribute or associate with mental health problems. And two separate studies that we did, we found out that use of antibiotics was highly correlated with anxiety and depression. We know now, and this is also a new field of study, the microbiome. We know that now the bacteria that we host in our gut has what's called a symbiotic relationship with humans. So these bacteria actually outnumber the number of human cells, and these have their own genes, so they produce their own proteins. So these bacteria help humans with for example, digesting some of the food that we cannot digest, but also they help with the health of the gut. So when people take antibiotic and they wipe out all this healthy bacteria, because the antibiotic will kill the unhealthy and healthy bacteria. And the next time they eat food is never sterile, right? So we may be ingesting harmful bacteria. So the harmful bacteria establish in the gut, they start producing their own toxin. Toxin would lead to an immune reaction, so we have inflammation. And this inflammation could be all over our body, because we create what's called the leaky gut. There will be holes in the gut wall that would seep some toxins and some unwanted stuff into the bloodstream, leading to what's called low-grade inflammation. So people, when they take antibiotics, they have to first complete the full course, but then at the same time they have to replenish the healthy bacteria by eating probiotics, food with probiotics. That would be helpful. Example would be, let's say, yogurt, fermented food. These would be good sources. But there's a gut-brain communication, and this happens through a major nerve called the vagus nerve. So when we have good bacteria, the good bacteria is producing brain chemicals that could affect the vagus nerve and affect the function of the brain in a positive way. But when we have the unhealthy bacteria which produce toxins and cause inflammation, the vagus nerve is affected, but it's affected in a negative way. So we also have problems with concentration, memory, and mental health. It's known that all people who have gut problems, like they have inflammation in the gut or other type of diseases, they tend to have mental health problems as well.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting topic, because a lot of people probably aren't aware maybe that they have it, and they'll probably think, oh, if I keep just trying to eat the normal diet, they aren't repopulating what's needed, so the problem just persists and it can become really frustrating.
And I also would like to add, even without taking antibiotics, these bacteria feed on the food we consume. We have evolved with these bacteria, and these bacteria have evolved on a wholesome diet. So when we stop eating a wholesome diet, when we resort to eating processed food, these bacteria are not getting the full nutrition. So we're causing those bacteria to die. So next time we eat the unhealthy or food with some unhealthy bacteria, we're establishing the unhealthy bacteria. So we don't have to take the antibiotic to do that. We could be doing this through our diet, or poor diet.
Yeah.
Through,
I think it's an important distinction. Yeah, I think it's really important, and it's super helpful. You mentioned briefly earlier about the prefrontal cortex being the CEO of the brain. It controls the high emotions. I was wondering if we could just dive into a bit more detail about the prefrontal cortex and how it operates and interacts with other parts of the brain.
Sure. The brain matures as we move with age. So the last part of the brain to mature is the prefrontal cortex, and its maturity completes by mid to late 20s. Anything we do before its complete maturation may be affecting the degree of its maturation. So the more mature prefrontal cortex, the wiser the person is going to be, the more control over the emotions will happen. Kids, or I tell my students that anything they do at this point may be affecting them. So alcohol drinking, drug use, poor nutrition, all of these could be affecting the degree of the prefrontal cortex maturation. As we get older, when we pass the maturity stage, as we get older, we start losing brain volume. So part of losing brain volume is also losing the prefrontal cortex.
So you talk about the prefrontal cortex maturing when we're kind of 18 to 29. How would you explain children who are kind of abnormally mature? Because I've spoken to 17-year-olds who just, it seem like they have their life together. Have they taken more, like loads more nutrition earlier on, or are they just kind of an anomaly in the process?
So brain maturity follows a time, window of time. Obviously, there is a need for good nutrition. There should be also absence of anything that's going to derange the brain chemistry, because you need to have an optimal brain chemistry to complete the maturation. There's also genetic factors, so different things could affect the maturity of the prefrontal cortex. Maybe more hardworking students, the more you use the brain, the more you build the brain. So it's like the muscle. The more you use your muscle, the more you're building the muscles. The same thing with students. So there could be multiple factors. But if people are eating poorly, or maybe abusing certain substances, the degree of maturity is going to be affected. And it all depends on when they started. So the sooner they start, the more the brain is affected, the later the start, maybe less effect.
Okay.
So there are multiple factors affecting that.
You mentioned briefly before as well that as the CEO of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it controls our emotions. It has a role in impulsivity. Clearly, it's a very important part of the brain. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about the other areas as well that it might be in control of, just to really hammer home, because I think for some people they hear prefrontal cortex and they don't really make the connection. They don't really see its importance.
Like as I said, it helps with cognition. It helps with weighing the cons and pros of things. It helps with planning for the future. It helps with like emotional regulation, as I said, solving problems. So that's why I call it the CEO, because it really takes care of so many things, but at the higher level. Okay. I hope I answered your question.
Absolutely, and it was kind of off the cuff, but that was really, really helpful. I just think when we talk about prefrontal cortex, clearly you know what it's about, but for a lot of people it will just go over their head and they won't really see the gravity in it. Really helpful, so thank you. On the topic of kind of the things that we can give our prefrontal cortex to help it mature, I know that you've done some work into drug abuse and the implications there. I was wondering if you could explain, particularly with the music industry, it's a stressful environment and there will always be that desire for instant gratification. I'm wondering if you could go through in a bit more detail why we should avoid drugs when we have that urge to feel good. And if we ignore that and we do take drugs, what the implications are.
Okay, I think as musicians, you have an advantage over other people, because playing music by itself is a source of the feeling good chemicals. Mostly there's something called dopamine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with dopamine. Dopamine is a brain chemical that we release to support survival. So for example, when you eat a pizza, you enjoy the pizza, you learn to eat the pizza. So our brain releases dopamine. We learn that it's a pleasurable feeling because you enjoy eating the pizza. The pleasurable feeling is going to help you eat more in the future to stay alive. Maybe pizza was not the perfect
I'm holding you to that. I'm going to eat more pizza.
Because I'm trying to say that we have to eat healthy, but it's like enjoying food. Enjoying food means we're going to be getting more food, more nutrients to our cells. So releasing some amount of dopamine is good for us. Playing music is a source of dopamine. Musicians can produce normally a good amount of dopamine, and the problem with dopamine, it becomes addictive. So if you do things on a regular basis and you're always releasing dopamine, you become addicted to this, which is a good thing at a lower level. So same thing with exercise. If you exercise and you feel like every time you run, you're enhancing your performance, you become addicted to running and you like to do that. However, the problem is with drugs, same with alcohol, they also target the dopamine system. But with alcohol and drugs, we raise the bar with dopamine, and that's why we feel great when we first consume alcohol and people do drugs. The problem is this is abnormal to the brain. Because it's abnormal, it has to adapt to this abnormality. Adaptation means we're going to lower the number of receptors or the proteins that respond to dopamine. This causes dependence. So the brain becomes now dependent on this amount of alcohol or this amount of drugs to feel okay. So playing music by itself now is no longer satisfying to people. So they feel like they have to be drinking or doing drugs in order to feel okay. But then when they go through the stress, they feel like they need to boost that dopamine. So they increase the alcohol drinking or they do more drugs. So now they are raising the bar, but the brain has to adapt by lowering the number of the dopamine receptors. So it becomes a vicious cycle, and it will be harder and harder to go back to the normal state of the brain. It's not impossible, but the longer people do it, the harder it's going to be back to normal.
So I guess with all of that discussion about how we are kind of hurting our brains potentially, you mentioned previously the prefrontal cortex matures between roughly 18 and 29. Let's say someone is just watching this video and they're over 29 and they've maybe done a bit of damage to their brain and they want to make a change. Are there any actions that they can take to kind of either reverse or at least heal the damage that's already been done?
So there are two schools of thought. The old school of thought will tell you that the brain goes through window of time, as I said, and if you miss one window, it's hard to be replacing the damage. But now, with the imaging studies, we're learning that the brain can adapt, the brain can change, and the term to it is the brain is plastic, neuroplasticity, meaning that the brain will adapt, will adjust. It has to be really a religious practice, meaning that people have really to stick to a certain practice in order for them to see an improvement. So maybe like doing it every now and then is not going to help, because if we look more into the cellular events, the more people do something, and it's true for everything in our body, humans are able to adapt through changes first in chemicals like hormones, but then we change our gene functions. So when it gets to the gene function, then it will be hard to reverse it. It's not impossible, but the more we practice something, the harder it's going to be to reverse that gene function. People should not be discouraged. If they're really willing to do something, they really have to follow strictly like the new practice, and they hopefully will see a change.
And so I guess in that same train of thought, when it's putting the responsibility on the individual, sticking to it, being a bit stricter, making these choices. When you take musicians, for example, in a musician's standard schedule, it's very sporadic, and it's a regularly occurring feature that they will be doing an all-day session, or they're touring across the country, or they're doing a late-night gig at 2 a.m. When it comes to nutrition, and let's say they're stuck in a roadside garage, what should they be focusing on?
I think the best way to do it is to plan ahead. If you plan ahead, you probably would be able to plan based on the budget and plan having maybe snacks or food that when you don't have time to cook or go to places, you have handy food, and this is going to be the healthy food. So I think planning ahead is the best advice I could give them.
And in terms of the specific food that they should be targeting, are there any groups that are better on the go? Is it kind of nuts and fruit, or are there kind of different foods that help better?
Nuts and fruits are excellent snacks, but they also need to be looking for more wholesome food. So avoid all the processed food, because this is going to be the easiest and maybe the cheapest on the go. But if they plan ahead, maybe salads, lean protein, complex carbohydrates, like anything that's whole, like 100% whole wheat, whole pasta. These things can help them with meeting most of the nutrients they need. But yes, nuts and vegetables for snacking is great.
And if you may not have an answer to this one, if you had to pick one takeaway, what would be the best takeaway that people should go for?
Salad.
Okay.
Salad with chicken and almonds.
There we go.
And olive oil as dressing.
They've heard it. That's what they need to order. I love it. So in terms of all of this information, it's incredibly useful. If someone were to watch this video, it's a lot to take in. Are there any initial first steps that you would recommend they take? And I saw your article about the virtuous and vicious cycles, and obviously it would be quite nice that we all enable virtuous cycles. Are there any initial first steps that people should adopt to improve their nutrition?
I think the first thing they have to be convinced that they want to make the change. I think it all comes from our brain, right? If we have the intention, then we can do it. If there's a will, there's a way. People have to be convinced, and once they're convinced, they can take action. They're more willing to continue with the changes. It's always great also to educate yourself. Not everything online is is credible. So maybe look into the credible sources. But it's very important for people to understand what's going on in order to make the change. I know from my students, they come to class, they're not convinced about changing their diet, but after they learn the why we should not be eating this, why we should not be doing drugs, why we should not be like drinking alcohol, this is when they make the decision because they're informed about the consequences. And I would encourage all people to start doing more homework and read from credible sources about the consequences. And this is when maybe they become convinced that I have to make that step and move forward with it.